It is past midnight in Bucharest, and it is raining the kind of rain that empties a city. The boulevards are black and shining and deserted. Anyone with any sense is indoors. And this is precisely the weather he has been waiting for. For more than a year, on the worst nights this city could produce, a man hunted its streets. The harder it rained, the closer he was. And the people who governed Bucharest refused, almost until the very end, to admit that he existed at all. Because in the Romania of 1970, he was not supposed to be possible. Crime, the state taught, was a sickness of the capitalist West. Under socialism, the school book said, there were no monsters. So when the women began to die, beaten and bitten and left in the rain, the official response was silence. This is the story of the man the city would come to call the Vampire of Bucharest. How he was hunted, how he was caught, and how he died still begging for the life he had denied to others. But it is also the story of a second truth, buried far deeper than the first. One that would not surface until a year after they shot him on a steel table in a morgue, out of a single fingerprint. The first to die, in the spring of 1970, was a woman named Elena Opreia. She was attacked in the dark, close to her own home. She was not the last. Over the months that followed, the same thing happened again, and it was always the same shape. A woman alone, walking late. A night of terrible weather. And by morning, something that did not seem entirely the work of a man. He came only after midnight, and he came only in the foulest weather the city had to offer. Driving rain, snowstorms, freezing fog. The investigators would understand, far too late, that this was not chance. The storms were his accomplice. They swept the streets clean of witnesses, smothered every sound, and washed the evidence into the gutters. He had learned to use bad weather the way a predator uses tall grass. The women of Bucharest sensed it before the authorities would breathe a word. They stopped going out alone after dark. They moved in groups, or on the arm of a man. Fear did the work the newspapers would not, because the newspapers said nothing at all. That silence was a decision. To admit that a sexual predator was loose in the capital of a workers' republic was to admit that socialism had not abolished the oldest darkness in human beings. So the details were withheld, the case kept quiet, and into that vacuum poured the one thing the regime feared almost as much as the killer himself: rumor. With no facts to hold on to, the city manufactured its own. And chief among them was the whisper that every woman he had killed was blonde. The rumor was false, but it is easy to see how it spread. Several of the murdered women were fair-haired, and so, in the mouth of a terrified city, he became the killer of blondes. Women dyed their hair dark to feel safe. In truth, the ones who survived were as often blonde as brunette. He did not select them by the color of their hair. He selected them by opportunity. A woman alone, on a night when no one sane would be outside to see. What he did to them is hard to set down plainly, and here the record and the legend are difficult to pull apart. He used a hammer, a hatchet, a length of iron pipe. He bit them. Of that, the forensic examiners were certain. The investigators who worked the case would go further and say that he drank their blood. True or exaggerated, it was that detail, more than any other, that gave him the name which has outlived everyone involved: the Vampire of Bucharest. By the end, 4 women were dead. At least 10 more had been attacked and had lived. The survivors carried what they had seen out into a city that did not want to hear it. And from their accounts, and from the silent evidence of the scenes themselves, the faintest outline of an impossible man began to take shape. The turning point for the investigation, if not for the dead, came with the murder of a young waitress named Gheorghiță Popa. She was killed on a street called Strada Vulturilor, the Street of the Vultures. The enormous police operation that followed took its name from that street. They called it Operation Vulture. It became the largest manhunt in the history of communist Romania. Thousands of officers were pushed onto the streets at night. Patrol cars, motorcycles, plainclothes, men folded into doorways. More than 2,000 people were stopped, questioned, detained, released. The apparatus of a police state, an apparatus built and perfected to hunt the enemies of the regime, was turned for once against an ordinary murderer. And for month after month, it failed. He went on killing. The storms went on coming. The machine arrested its thousands and caught nothing, and the public, still, was told almost nothing at all. The most watched city in the Eastern Bloc could not find one student with a hatchet in a bag. When the break finally came, it did not come from the vast machinery of the manhunt. It came from a single sodden scrap of paper. Beneath the body of his last victim, a woman named Mihaela Ursu, killed in the first days of May 1971, the investigators found a medical note. The rain had soaked it through and dissolved the name written on it. But the printed letterhead survived. It led them to a clinic for university students and to a single doctor's office and to a diagnosis: suspected epilepsy. They gathered every such note the office had issued that spring, 83 of them. Then they looked for the students who had never come back to collect their files. 15 names remained. One of them belonged to a veterinary student called Ion Rîmaru. On the 27th of May, 1971, they came to his dormitory. He was out. When he returned, he was carrying a bag, and inside the bag were a hatchet and a kitchen knife. The Vampire of Bucharest, the terror of a city of more than 1 million people, was a 24-year-old student who had failed the same year of school twice. This was the part people found hardest to bear. Not a fiend out of a folk tale. A quiet, forgettable young man. His professors remembered someone withdrawn and slow, with a thin vocabulary and almost no interests. His classmates remembered someone they had instinctively avoided without ever being able to say why. By day, he sat in lectures he could not pass. By night, on the worst nights only, he became the thing the entire city had been dreaming about. At his trial in the autumn of 1971, he confessed. A plea of insanity was raised and rejected. When the death sentence was read aloud, the courtroom is said to have broken into applause. He was taken to Jihlava prison, and on the 23rd of October, he was led out before a firing squad. He did not go quietly. He fought and had to be dragged to the post. And the last words anyone wrote down from the man who had shown his victims nothing were a plea for himself. Vrosa Trăiesc, I want to live. And there the story should end. A monster discovered, a monster destroyed, a frightened city finally permitted to breathe. Except that the story of Ion Rîmaru does not end against the wall at Jihlava. It ends a year later, and it ends with his father. Florea Rîmaru drove a tram through the Bucharest night. He was, by every account anyone gave at the time, an ordinary man. A poor husband, a distant father, and nothing more than that. During his son's investigation, he had been pulled in and released. Under Romanian law, a father could not be made to testify against his own child. When the son was executed, the father buried him and went on with his small grey life. For about a year. In October of 1972, almost to the day after the firing squad, Ion Rîmaru fell from a moving train and died. Officially, it was an accident. His body was carried to the Forensic Institute in Bucharest, and there, by a coincidence that still feels too clean to be true, it passed under the eye of a criminologist named Constantin Tsurai, a man who had spent a lifetime with fingerprints, and who had carried, for nearly 30 years, one set he had never been able to name. Because in 1944, in the chaos of the war a quarter of a century earlier, 4 women had been murdered in Bucharest. Women in ground floor rooms, attacked at night, in storms, through their own windows, their heads beaten in. The case had gone cold. The fingerprints left at the scenes had matched no living person on file. Tsurai had never thrown them away. When he pressed the dead tram driver's fingers to that 28-year-old record, they matched. Ion Rîmaru, the investigators concluded, had murdered 4 women in 1944, in very nearly the same way his son would murder 4 women in 1970. The father had never been suspected, never charged. He had lived out a quiet life and raised a family. And, the evidence now said, he had done it first. No one can tell you now what passed between that father and that son. Whether the boy knew, whether something was taught, or something was inherited, or whether something in that family simply surfaced again across a generation, like a fault line waking under a city. At the end, Ion claimed his father had made him what he was. His father, while he lived, denied it flatly. They are both a long time dead, and whatever the truth was, it went into the ground with them. What remains is only the shape of it. 2 men, a generation apart, hunting women through the same city on the same kind of nights. And a state that managed, twice, to bury what had happened. In 1944, beneath the fog of a war. In 1971, beneath the fog of an idea that simply could not allow such a man to exist. The Vampire of Bucharest was never one man, he was 2. And the second was only ever found by accident, by an old man who could not bring himself to let go of a fingerprint. The files of the East are full of stories like this one. Crimes that were solved and then buried and then forgotten, because remembering them was an embarrassment to someone with power. We open them back up, one at a time. This has been Eastern Files. The next one is already on the table.